Greetings everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you for this very special lecture which is on International Women's Day. I wish you all many happy returns of the day, not only today but always. So we all should be celebrating International Women's Day, and we all should be proud of the achievements not only of humanity but also of women, men and everyone. And today's day is especially important because we are going to talk about gender equality for a sustainable tomorrow. Now, before the onset of the lecture, let us first think and talk about that why gender equality matters. Gender equality is an important goal in itself, which is MDG 3rd, and also contributes to the achievement of several other objectives. For example, it stimulates growth, it reduces poverty, inequities, and also contributes to child development. International Women's Day, which is celebrated world over on March 8th, is a global day celebrating the socio-economic, cultural and political achievements of women, and is a call to action for accelerating women's equality. Let us now talk about what were the themes now and then. So if we are talking about International Women's Day theme for 2022, it is Break the Bias. But if we look at the earlier such themes, then in 2021 it was Choose to Challenge. The 2020 theme was Each for Equal. 2019's was Balance for Better. In 2018, the theme of International Women's Day was Press for Progress. 2017, it was Be Bold for Change, and the 2016 theme was Pledge for Parity. The UN also issued a theme, Women in Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 world, which was in 2021, whereas the UN's 2022 theme celebrates efforts from girls and women in creating a more equal, sustainable future. So basically, one can say that International Women's Day has been a culmination of public as well as private struggles of women. And these struggles had been waged by women for their rights. International Women's Day is a United Nations sanctioned global holiday. It celebrates women's contributions to society, raises awareness about the fight for gender parity, and inspires support for organizations that help women globally. Let us now talk about some past legends associated with this day. Already in early Rome, there was a Women's Day that was marked by matrons. On this day, matrons would freely roam around, they would receive gifts from their husbands, and the slaves would also receive gifts. Then coming to 1857, on 8th March, working women in several textile and clothing factories, as they were called garment workers, in New York, USA, protested against inhuman working conditions and very low wages for which they faced police brutality. So we can say that the genesis of modern International Women's Day can be traced to such struggles that were waged by working class women. They revived their protest again after 2 years, formed labor unions to negotiate for rights in the workplace, and also took out a march in the month of March. Then another very important event that can be highlighted was on 25th March 1911, which is known as the tragic Triangle Fire. This was marked by loss of several young immigrant girls' lives in garment factory fire in New York due to lack of safety measures. So, this resulted in huge protest and silent funeral march brought together a crowd of more than 1 lakh protesters, and most of the protesters were women. The Triangle Fire deeply influenced future labor legislation as well as women's mobilization, because this was a moment when women from all walks of life came together and started raising demands. Then one can also highlight a number of other struggles that were waged by working women. According to the United Nations, International Women's Day started in America in 1909, when the Socialist Party of America took to the streets to honor garment workers who had protested against inhumane working conditions in the years before. They called it National Women's Day, and it took place on February 28th. In 1910, at the International Conference of Women, socialists in Copenhagen, Clara Zetkin, suggested to celebrate the 8th of March as the day of struggle for equality of women with men. The Social International established Women's Day in Copenhagen to celebrate those working for women's rights as well as universal suffrage. So, if we trace history of International Women's Day, then we can say that for the first time IWD was held on March 8 in 1914, simultaneously in 6 countries like Austria, Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, Russia and Switzerland. And the reason why March 8th was chosen was that on this date in 1848, Prussian king had promised women voting rights due to threat of an armed insurrection. That is another matter, however, that the promise remained unfulfilled and led women to distribute millions of leaflets in Germany asking for voting rights before International Women's Day 1911. In 1911, more than 1 million people attended rallies focused on suffrage representation, education, workers' rights, and over the next few years, more and more countries in Europe marked the holiday on March 8th. However, it was not until March 8th, 1975, when during International Women's Year, the United Nations celebrated it as an official holiday. Since 1975, the holiday has gained awareness around the globe as a way to recognize women's contribution. And the International Women's Day date was moved to March 8th from 1913 onwards. The UN drew global attention to women's concerns in 1975 by calling for an International Women's Year. It also convened the first conference on women in Mexico that year. The UN General Assembly invited member states to proclaim March 8th as the UN Day for Women's Rights and International Peace in 1977. The day aimed to help nations worldwide eliminate discrimination against women. It also focused on helping women gain full and equal participation in global development. International Men's Day is also celebrated on November 19th each year. Now, a very important lesson that we have all learned over the past 2 years is that how unless and until both men and women work together, crisis cannot be combated. Women stand at the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis as healthcare workers, caregivers, innovators, community organizers, and the most exemplary national leaders in combating the pandemic. The crisis has truly highlighted both the centrality of their contributions and the disproportionate burdens that women carry. However, despite facing so much and despite delivering in the best possible way, there is the problem of disproportionate representation. So, there is disproportionate and inadequate representation of women in national and global policy spaces. Women can make irreplaceable contributions to decisions, policies, and laws that work better for all. Heads of governments in Denmark, Ethiopia, Finland, Germany, Iceland, New Zealand, and Slovakia have been widely recognized for the rapidity, decisiveness, and effectiveness of their national response to natural as well as man-made disasters, as well as the compassionate communication of public health information. Yet, women are heads of state in very few countries. Several new barriers have also emerged post-pandemic, in addition to persistent pre-existing social, economic, and systemic barriers to female participation and leadership. Several new barriers and bottlenecks have emerged. Across the world, women have faced increased domestic violence, unpaid care duties, unemployment, poverty, etc. post COVID-19. So therefore, it would not be wrong to recollect the statement that was made by Virginia Woolf, that most of history can be described as his story. For most of history, Anonymous was a woman. Now, I would try to recollect few women who had really made important contributions historically, and they continue to also prevail in the current times. Their philosophy remains very, very relevant. For example, Mary Wollstonecraft, who was the founder of modern feminism, and her famous book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, that came out in 1792. It declared that the divine right of husbands, like the divine right of kings, should be contested without danger. She further stated that she did not wish to have power over men, but she wanted women that they should have power over themselves. Then another very influential female was Elizabeth Stanton, who was a founder of women's suffrage movement in the US. Her famous Declaration of Sentiments that came out in 1848, she stated that the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. Then Clara Zetkin, who was a German socialist feminist, also was quite instrumental. And one cannot but talk about women's suffrage march that took place in New York in 1913. The right to vote did not come easily, and it was after a long drawn out struggle. Finally, it was in 1776 that landed white men over the age of 21 years got voting rights in 1776, while women got this right as late as 1920 in US. In UK, women got voting rights in 1928, in Canada around mid 1920s, and then from 20th century revolutions onwards, granting women the right to vote became a standard feature and practice. One can also highlight, if one is talking about history of International Women's Day, then one can highlight some interesting posters like the Soviet poster of 1920, which kind of ridiculed the kitchen drudgery, and it declared outrightly that wasting time in kitchen was no longer the only preoccupation that women should be concerned about. There were a series of marches also from 1917 onwards in Russia, in which a large number of women demonstrated, and they declared rather, that voting rights could not be considered as universal if women did not have them. So therefore it was declared that the whole process of democracy and granting voting rights was illogical if only half of the population was given those rights. Then one can also talk about the world wars, the two world wars, and how these two world wars drew women into the public sphere. So women started playing important roles not only as fighters, as spies, but also as medics, as nurses, and they were very active on the war front. And there were a large number of Soviet women who played very important role as pilots as well. So on the whole, one can say a very important statement that was made by Margaret Thatcher, that in politics, if you want anything said, ask a man, and if you want anything done, ask a woman. So this kind of carefully clarifies that women cannot be described only as thinkers or as visionaries, but rather women as doers. Now let us talk briefly about women's movement and how the present situation where the entire world is celebrating International Women's Day kind of arrived. So there were three waves of women's liberation movement. The first wave that can be identified was from 19th to early 20th century, in which the main aim was to attain right to vote, that is political equality. Then the second stage that can be identified was from 1960s to 1980s, which was largely marked by the goal of attaining socio-cultural equality, because political equality had already been attained, but it had really failed to bring about major changes in lives of women. And then from 1990s onwards, the continuing struggle for social equality. So the term feminism, which first appeared in the late 19th century as a social movement, largely focused on the reduction or elimination of racial inequality, as well as promotion of the rights and interests of women. The women's liberation movement first appeared in France, then Netherlands in 1870s, in Great Britain in 1890s, and finally in US from 1910 onwards. So what were the relevant issues that were appearing in all the countries? One was, of course, the struggle against violence, women trafficking, the fight for equality at workplace, also the fight against sexual harassment, the struggle to reconcile professional as well as family responsibilities, and the struggle for equality in political participation. The struggle for equality between local and migrant women, fight against poverty, unemployment among women, and the struggle for peace. Basically, the struggle against sexism also in media. Now, UN has played a very important role as far as the issues of gender equality are concerned. The Charter of United Nations, signed in 1945, was the first international agreement to affirm the principle of equality between both the sexes, and the implications of inequality were clearly identified. For example, inequality diverts resources, it rewards only men, it obstructs partnerships, and it also reduces women's effectiveness. However, there are several ambivalences that have appeared over a period of time. For example, in economic participation, there has been a large decline in the labor force participation of women, and this trend is more and more visible in countries like India, especially in post-pandemic stages. Women are also getting less economic opportunities than men due to several reasons. There are some valid concerns in the rural areas. In the villages, women do most of the housework and other unpaid work and have no time to do outside jobs. But for urban women, even when they get jobs, there is a concern about the safety of transport from the family, as well as the problem of very low wages, as well as issues of sexual harassment. So while we have discussed all these issues, we also need to keep in mind that unless and until we are able to attain gender equality in several parameters, a sustainable tomorrow cannot be achieved. Thank you.